Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Elizabeth Brownlee. I'm really delighted today to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Neil Gong. I apologize. I'm going to stay off camera today. I had a health issue over the weekend, and I'll be here with us. I wish I were in best shape for this very special event, but we'll make do. Very grateful to have Neil with us today. Neil Gong is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at UCSD. He completed his PhD in sociology at UCLA in 2019. The title of his talk today, uh, Social Prognosis, How Inequality Shapes Clinical Vision and Recovery from Mental Illness. It may sound familiar or it may sound straightforward, the kind of topic we've been so concerned with lately, and rightfully so, thinking about the impact of inequality, the impact of social structures on our patients. Very, very important set of concerns, and Dr. Gong's work is right square in the center of that very important set of questions we've been confronting lately. But I do want to say one of the most impressive and to me most profound impacts of his work, as I've experienced it over the last several years, is that it really has helped me to see things in new ways, to see our patients in new ways, to see our work and our own role as psychiatrists and mental health providers in new ways, and to understand our institutions, our clinical structures in new ways. And I will say that that is rare. It's unusual for me to be able to interact with a scholar who really helps me see something new and frames things in such an important, rigorous way that helps to make new things visible. That's what theory is all about, and I really think Neil's work is very impactful, and we're really lucky to have had him as a part of our UCLA community and as a part of our UC community of scholars. So glad that you can hear from him today. I'm just going to say a couple things about some of his work. The forthcoming book, coming out in March of 2024, Sons, Daughters, and Sidewalk Psychotics, Mental Illness and Homelessness in Los Angeles. Very, very relevant for this audience. It will be out by the University of Chicago Press quite soon. I highly recommend reading it. You'll find it familiar and, again, instructive. And it builds on an important paper of his from 2019 from the American Sociological Review called Between Tolerant Containment and Concerted Constraint, Managing Madness for the City and the Privileged Family. And I think we'll be able to hear about those two contrasts in the talk today. Before I turn it over to him, I want to highlight for you a paper of his that I really see as essential reading for anyone thinking about insight in psychosis or autonomy or issues of ethics in psychosis. Neil Gong's work from 2017 that was published in Theory and Society. It's called That Proves You Mad Because You Know It Not, Impaired Insight and the Dilemma of Governing Psychiatric Patients as Legal Subjects. And incredibly important, I think, framing of the issue of insight and how we as psychiatrists can begin to better understand the concept and work with it responsibly. The other thing I'll thank Neil for is that he's been very active in publishing in public-facing settings, including the San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post, and the Atlantic, talking about issues like the closure of boarding cares and the struggles of our psychiatric institutions. And I think we owe him gratitude for bringing attention to those important issues that affect us so much. So I also recommend taking a look at some of that work that he's done in journals. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to you, Neil. Thanks again for being with us. I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much for that very kind and generous introduction, Beth. And it's a real pleasure to be here and present this material to clinicians, to people who are in the midst of actually working with folks. Let me make sure this screen share is working. I'll just presume it is. So today I'll be talking about inequality and how inequality shapes mental health care through what I've been calling social prognosis. But first, just to say a little bit about me for context. So I came to this work actually, after planning to work in clinical care, my first job after college was on an assertive community treatment team. So I was part of a case management team that helped people who were homeless and diagnosed with serious psychiatric disabilities and were moving into apartments off of the street. And I became really interested in, the fact that people were rotating through the jail, shelter, hospital circuit, and really became interested in these systemic problems that seem beyond any individual's control or any individual clinician's control. And a clinical psychologist on the team had suggested to me that maybe what I really wanted to do was to become a sociologist and try to address these systemic issues. And I mean, yeah, that's kind of part of how my path started. And today, as Beth mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at UCSD. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about this book that she mentioned, Sons, Daughters, and Sidewalk Psychotics. So it's a comparative ethnography of services in LA, public safety net care versus elite private care. And the basic conceit of the book is that since deinstitutionalization, we've talked about community care, sort of in the singular, right? In contrast to like institutional settings. But in fact, we have different community cares for different communities. And through the book, I talk about how we have people have unequal experiences of illness, unequal experiences of what recovery means, which will be central for today, and even unequal ideas about and experiences of client choice and what client choice or client empowerment mean for people who are, on the one hand, people we think of as kind of social problems, sidewalk psychotics, versus beloved sons and daughters. And that's where the title of the book comes from. So just as a roadmap, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about thinking sociologically. I know some folks here are very much steeped already in social medicine. For others who are less so, I'll just at least say a bit about how I think about doing sociology. Then I'll talk about this framework, what I'm calling social prognosis. I'll take us through a literature review of people I'm in dialogue with in the social sciences to where we're going, methods and case selection. The bulk of the talk will be findings, comparative data and analysis from looking at these clinics for the rich and the poor. And then I'll close with some implications for practice. And again, I'm very excited to hear your feedback as people who are in the field. So what do sociologists do? There are different definitions, but the way I think about it is we primarily tackle a particular social phenomenon or issue by looking at it comparatively. So this might mean looking at things cross-nationally, it might mean looking cross-culturally, or it might mean looking at things across different forms of stratification, such as across class lines. And methodologically speaking, we are pretty pluralistic. So some of us use field research, some use stats, some use historical analysis. The idea is drawing tools from the various social sciences, whatever seems needed to tackle the given issue. And ultimately, our focus is on trying to understand social institutions in the sense of the kind of taken for granted human-made rules of the game in any given social arena. Now, these might be formal legal kinds of rules, it might be cultural norms. And then again, this comparison can be really useful for revealing these taken for granted ideas. So something that might seem obvious when you're living in that cultural setting, if you're in another one, you look back at it with fresh eyes. So what that means for today's talk is I'm going to be doing a comparison of clinics by social class, so these public safety net versus elite private psychiatric clinics in Los Angeles. Methodologically, doing ethnography, so long-term participant observation in these different worlds. And the idea is that I'll be using these comparisons to unsettle things that are taken for granted. So things that might feel obvious when you just look at them in one setting, when you contrast it with what's happening somewhere else, suddenly it becomes more interesting and we can critically analyze it in a new way. And so the social prognosis framework, the basic idea, right, is if a psychiatric or medical prognosis describes the predicted duration, course, and function around illness, the social prognosis is going to refer to the types of lives and identities people with that illness can expect to have. And one of the crucial things I'm going to try to demonstrate is that the social prognosis does not live in the patient, but within this kind of clinical context. It's a concept I developed in the book, and I'm very curious what your perspective again will be on it as we go through. And my claim is that these social prognoses are tied into different projects and ways of seeing mental illness. So when mental illness is construed as a problem of urban policy and public space, it leads to a vision of recovery this basically says we're looking to make people, not in jail, not homeless, not triggering 911 calls. And the social prognosis for a patient is thus tied to these kinds of things, and it comes with certain kinds of practices, namely housing first and a kind of generalized harm reduction as the key intervention. On the other hand, when mental illness is framed in terms of elite family crisis, the vision of recovery is very different. It's about creating class respectable identities. And with that entails a different kind of practice around like a variety of therapies for normalization and behavioral transformation. And so you also have a different view of client choice here than that generalized harm reduction. And I know this might seem a little abstract right now, but I'm going to work up to this analysis of social prognosis through the rest of the talk. And I think it'll become clearer once you see some of the qualitative data presented comparatively. And again, since this is we have a lot of practitioners in the audience, and I'm hoping that this could be useful for you to think with. So just some things to keep in mind as we're going through. How does social prognosis shape the way clinicians view patients and treat patients? How should clinicians serve patients who do not fit with the clinic level expectations, which again will make more sense as we go through. And then if the social prognosis is embedded in the broader social context and not just clinical interaction, what can doctors do about that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about three literatures that I'm building on and bringing together, although trying to do something a little different with. I'm going to talk about class inequality and serious mental illness. I'm going to talk about what's known as labeling theory, and then I'll talk about the recovery movement and bring these together. So a classic longstanding finding in psychiatric epidemiology is that serious mental illness is associated with lower class status. So you've probably seen some variation on this kind of gradient that I have in this image here. And people have different ways of talking about this. So there's sort of debate between what's known as social causation versus social drift. So is it that marginalized people are exposed to more stressors, and therefore are they more likely to become ill or have worse illness? That's one possibility, social causation. Or is it social drift, that people who experience serious disability kind of fall through the class structure and become poor? And today, most researchers think these are complementary, not competing explanations. Another thing I'm engaged with here is this idea of how labeling can generate self-fulfilling prophecies. So the classic sociological literature on labeling theory was interested in how calling somebody socially deviant might create that said deviance. So the examples would be things like labeling a child a delinquent, and whether or not they were engaged in whatever behaviors, if it changes how the school institution and the family institution treat them, it may lead to them acting in these kind of delinquent ways. And there was a really bold claim in the 60s and 70s from labeling theory, which was that the same thing was happening with mental illness. The idea was that labeling people as mentally ill could change how society views them, how they view themselves, and lead to quote unquote crazy behavior and sort of have this self-fulfilling prophecy effect. By the 1980s, people were talking about what they called modified labeling theory. No one was really making these kind of ideological claims that mental illness was fully socially induced. But there was a lot of empirical research on how labeling somebody as crazy, could generate stigma and rejection, and then could lead to these kind of negative outcomes. So there is this focus on the real impacts of these kind of negative self-fulfilling prophecies. And precisely because of those kinds of negative self-fulfilling prophecies, ex-patient activists became really concerned with getting clinicians and others to have a more positive outlook. And so you had the recovery movement, the focus on the fact that people could recover, to focus on capacities instead of deficits. And this goes from being this kind of radical ex-patient movement discourse to being pretty mainstream. So it's codified in Bush II's New Freedom Commission on Mental Health from 2001 and the California Mental Health Services Act. Here's just one famous definition of recovery from Larry Davidson et al. In 2006. Recovery identifies and builds upon each individual's assets, strengths, and areas of health and competence to support the person in managing his or her condition while regaining a meaningful, constructive sense of membership in the broader community. And if you just look at some of the language from the California Mental Health Services Act, it's this emphasis on hope and personal empowerment. And again, getting away from these negative visions to a more positive vision. So here's how I'm engaged with these. So I'm trying to shift the question a little bit. So I'm not asking, with the social causation, social drift thing, are people poor because they're sick or sick because they're poor? I'm less interested in the way these negative beliefs are generating self-fulfilled prophecies And I'm not really asking, are these contemporary clinics doing a recovery model? Basically, everyone is doing some variation on a recovery model. They all use that language, most of them that I was seeing. But they have very different ideas about recovery, and that's what I'm focused on. So I'm asking, what are the visions of recovery for people of different social classes? And then how do these shape care practices in patient lives? Okay, so in terms of my methods, I'll talk a little bit about the logical comparison. I'll describe some of the main clinics I was looking at, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I was doing practically in terms of ethnography and participant observation. So people often ask me, like, why are you focused on these clinics for the rich and the poor, these case management teams at the opposite ends of the class spectrum? And in part, it was an empirically driven choice. So I'm sure some of you in your practices have run into this. The middle class options tend not to be great when it comes to serious mental illness. I would meet middle class families who were either going into debt to try to pay for elite care or switching their loved ones to Medicaid because the private insurance wouldn't cover things like community case management teams, even though like the ACT model was one of the gold standards of community psychiatry. So on the one hand, this was what there was to look at. Second, and getting back to that idea of comparison, there's an analytical advantage of these kinds of stark comparisons, which is the dynamics and mechanisms become more visible for analysis. And again, these kind of obvious things become non-obvious when we contrast them strongly. And a point I want to make is, even though I'm going to be using patients and their experiences, the focus, the unit of analysis here is actually the organization. So I'm kind of using these patients to get at how the clinics or the organizations are thinking and processing people. So here are the primary clinics I was embedded with. So with the Department of Mental Health, I was with the Full Service Partnership Program, find a staff ratio of about 16:1. 3 of the 8 field workers who were out doing home visits had masters. The funding situation is primarily different kinds of government funds. And the client classification requirement is the diagnosis of serious mental illness, homelessness, jail, and hospital discharge, some combination of that. And at the place I'm calling the Actualization Clinic, and that's a pseudonym, and I'll just also say all the names of patients and providers are pseudonyms here. There's also a community case management team, also kind of in this hospital without walls kind of ACT model. They had a client to staff ratio of about 8:1. All of their field workers had master's degrees, many in marriage and family therapy, some in social work, clinical psych PhD at the top. Funding is very different. It's primarily family cash pay. As I mentioned, insurance companies usually won't pay for stuff like this. So you're looking at maybe $6,000 a month for home visits. And then a lot of the patients were coming out of residential programs that range from $30,000 to plus a month. So it's quite expensive. And in terms of classification requirements, I mean, there really are none other than, can the family pay for it? And my methods are participant observation. So embedding, hanging out with people, trying to be there, see things up close in real time. And so between 2013 and 2015, I was a volunteer with a full service partnership. I was also volunteering with some street outreach programs, doing home visits, attended different kinds of groups, just hanging out with people. And then between 2015 and 2017, I was with private agencies. So I was an intern at the Actualization Clinic. I was also going to linked providers, so that could be some residential treatment facilities, dual diagnosis, some elite sober living homes, primarily on the West Side. And I was attending groups, going to an IOP, an intensive outpatient program, linked with them. One important difference is I didn't really get a lot of access to home visits. One of the things wealthy people are paying for is privacy. So I didn't get that much access to the family home, except when I was interviewing some parents. And then, okay, here are going to be 4 points of comparison. I'm going to take us through this now that we're at the kind of qualitative data bulk of the talk. So the first question is about what I call the clinical project. So what is the overall point of what the clinicians are doing, what they think they're doing? Then we'll talk about the kind of social prognosis that's appropriate to each clinic. How do they imagine recovery? Third, I'm going to talk about some cases of mismatch with people who don't quite fit the imagined vision of recovery in that clinic. And then I'm going to talk about how this shapes what client choice means in these different settings. So clinical project, yeah. How do workers understand their purpose? And the basic contrast is that DMH, workers understand what they're doing is mental health care in the context of urban poverty management, whereas at actualization, it's mental health care while managing family crises and trying to recover lost identities. So for DMH, I mean, housing is a primary goal because of the housing crisis in Los Angeles and the fact that so many patients are homeless. And here's what Laura, an FSP team leader, said. We're not so good at the rehabilitative side. It's no one's fault, really. It's just once we've covered the basics with one person, we have to move on to the next person to get them housed. And it's not just what they said or what I saw them do. I mean, it's built into the literal metrics. So when I was starting field work, I was reading the LA County Outcome Data Report, and the first line used to describe the full service partnerships was adult programs have demonstrated a 67% decrease in homelessness, 35% decrease in jail days, and a 15% decrease in hospital days. These are very reasonable things to focus on, but it shows you sort of what the priorities are. And also, I mean, there's also a more cynical take when you look at the wider ecology of services provided. So here's what Mr. Daniels, who operates a board and care on the West Side, said. He basically thought that he and others existed to save the state money. You know the economics of this thing. One of the reasons why we exist, and I don't just mean us, is so that people are not burdening Medi-Cal and therefore the state and their budget by being in the hospital. Okay, so what's the clinical project at actualization and their sister places? It's a very different frame than that. So there's an emphasis on protecting family reputations and feelings. And here's what Richard, the owner of the actualization clinic, told me. A manic or psychotic person with resources and connections can do so much damage, you wouldn't believe it, to their family business, to their community. So there's this kind of managing family crisis, even social control aspect to it, but it's also paired with a real vision of profound recovery. So here's what Deirdre, the clinical director at Actualization, said about rebuilding patient identities. We're not interested in how many hospitalizations have you had and what are your umpteen diagnoses. Do you want to make friends? Do you want to recreate? Do you want to go to school? Let's do it. Very positive. And here's what William, who's the owner of a private ACT team that shared some patients with the actualization clinic. William is not in LA, but part of the network. He said, I feel completely unlimited in what patients can achieve. So, you know, a family, kid's job, their symptoms are integrated into their lives, so they don't bother them, or maybe they even begin to see them as gifts. We dream kind of big about what we can do because you're not worried about the socioeconomic stuff. Okay, so, you know, I've told you how these clinicians see the relationship between mental health and this practice in this larger context. And now I'm going to present two people to help illustrate the kind of main social prognosis in each clinic. So how do these two clinics interpret and process people with a similar psychiatric profile, but very different social profile? So Gwen and Delilah are both women in their 50s, diagnosed with major depression, with psychosis. So at DMH, Delilah is a poor African-American woman who was living in front of Albertsons, and in actualization, Gwen is a wealthy white woman who was brought in by her family after hospitalizations in a residential program. So at DMH, Delilah is outreached on the street and brought into housing, and the team worked to stabilize her. I went on some home visits where they were concerned because she'd seemingly stopped eating, and the question was, do we have to put her in, right? So they're checking to see if it's crisis time to put her into the hospital. And the idea is basically monitoring crisis and keeping her housed. And so how do they think about her imagined future? And here's how Delilah talked about her life when I sat down with her. She said, well, I sit at home and I watch TV or listen to some music. I listen to a lot of gospel, stay in my room singing, reading the Bible, or getting rested. So she's staying in place. And at a certain point, one of the case managers says of Delilah, she's ready for that next step. And what they were imagining for Delilah, you know, where she could go from here, was that she was eventually going to age out of mental illness-linked supportive housing to age into senior housing. And then she wouldn't have to simply live with other DMH clients. Now, Gwen has a very different social prognosis and way that they make sense of what's going on. So Gwen is stabilized and goes through a variety of different kinds of treatment modalities, so meds, electroconvulsive therapy. I meet her in Actualization's IOP after she had come out of a psychoanalytically oriented residential program. And here's how a psychologist talked about what Gwen was going through. She said, I had a similar patient who had become psychotic after being a supermom and member of the community. Not consciously, but the psychotic issue was an exit strategy. And whether or not this is, a correct psychodynamic interpretation, it shows that they have a very different idea about who she is, how symptoms are maybe meaningful and connected to her life. And then it starts a question about where is she going to go next if she's no longer going to be a super mom in the same way. And a family psychologist on the team talked about how she has no voice within her family system. And so the goal becomes getting her voice back. And so when I talked to Gwen, she was on board with this. She said, I want to put myself back together. It's a big life change to have your kids grow up and leave the nest. So she talked about how she'd given up her career to be a mother. And once her kids left, and she lost that role and she didn't really know who she was anymore. That's how she was interpreting what she was going through. And so the team comes up with this idea, this kind of liberal feminism, that they're going to have her tell her family no. She's going to stand up to her family. She's still going to be part of the family system, of course, but she's going to take a more assertive role. And they also want her to return to work. So both of these are, in a sense, these kind of paradigmatic cases. They illustrate the social prognosis of what each clinic is hoping for, keeping somebody housed, and on the other hand, creating a robust identity. And here it's sort of working in each case, right? Delilah is on her way, and so is Gwen, although in these different kinds of worlds. Next, we're going to look at what happens when there's a bit of a disjuncture around the social prognosis, when these visions of recovery become detached from what clients seem to be experiencing or needing in the moment. So at DMH, we see this with clients who are recovering psychiatrically, but not socially because of what's available to them. And actualization, we have clients who aren't sort of making it in the prescribed way. I'll give you some examples. So at DMH, I got to know a guy named Jeremiah. He was a Jamaican man in his 30s, diagnosed with schizophrenia. I met him on outreach. He had a towel wrapped around his head and he was drawing in the sand and muttering. The DMH clinicians thought he was part of the target population. Moved him into housing. He did really well on Risperdal. And here's what a case manager said about Jeremiah. She said, that's what hope looks like. But from Jeremiah's perspective, he was totally stuck. And he's a case of what I'd call symptom recovery without social recovery. Here's what he said to me. He said, housing, food, clothes, like saying, these are great things DMH has helped me with. It should be more too, right? When you've gotten the person on the meds and they're doing fine, you want to get them to the point where they're working instead of just not having anything to do or feeling that you can't do anything, I'm still young. So on the one hand, I think he's, there's this vision of what the clinic can do, and okay, he's already sort of achieved that, but he was also trapped in this other way, which is some of you are sure aware, these kind of welfare benefit traps, which is that if Jeremiah does graduate, he risks losing some of the subsidies he has. If he does return to work and makes too much money from that, he risks losing other subsidies he has. So in a variety of ways, he's kind of trapped here. Now, at the actualization clinic, there's a very different way that this mismatched social prognosis plays out, which is that some people are seemingly achieving things, but because of the dominance of upper-class families' viewpoints, it becomes problematic. So I learned about a man in his 30s diagnosed with schizophrenia at the actualization clinic, and the clinic explained to me that he had gotten this job at a P.F. Chang's restaurant, but the family, from their viewpoint, was that he can do better, and he's guided to eventually quit this job. And there was debate here because it seemed to be this, very positive psychiatric rehabilitation outcome. But in this context, the way the clinic connects to the family, this is what happened. And there are other kinds of traps here, very different than the trap that Jeremiah is in, which is the trap of optimism. So I got to know this guy, Anthony, he was 50 years old at the time, diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he talked about how my biggest dream is to be cured and married. And I got to know him in IOP. He was really getting frustrated because he was doing everything he was supposed to. He was going to individual therapy. He was doing IOP, and things weren't changing. And here's what Nate, the IOP director, said. So his brother, Anthony's brother, is married and has a couple of kids and runs a successful business, and Anthony wants all of that for himself. But he's 50 and he's still struggling with his hallucinations. Treatment providers may have a different view of the likelihood of his ultimate plan succeeding. You don't want to discourage them from their dreams in any way. Nobody knows the future. And so I saw this strange thing where Anthony was upset and struggling, but the clinicians wouldn't tell him that they really thought this was an unrealistic goal for him. And I think a real cynical reading here might be something like the IOP wants to keep extracting money from his family, but I don't think it's not something quite that crass. The social prognosis here is of this kind of higher achievement. So there's this tension here between we want him to keep working towards this, although we don't think it's going to happen. And then another way it gets mismatched is through I ended up seeing as what I call like identity and isolation. So Shelley is a white woman in her 40s, diagnosed with bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. And at first I saw what seemed to be this kind of holistic intervention was that she wanted to be an actress. So the clinic started focusing on like, how can we support her in her goal of being an actress? So she just consumed a lot. She came from a very wealthy family. So she had acting lessons and psychic readings, all these different people to sort of support her dream. But the clinic realized she was actually becoming very isolated because she just had these paid friends. And Richard, the owner of the actualization clinic, said, all I can tell her is you're getting what you put out. And what he meant is he wanted her to do things like maybe give back to the community, not just take, not just buy, maybe volunteer. But what they ultimately concluded was, well, let's get her back to auditions. She was struggling, and this is what they were going to do. They were going to keep driving towards this kind of identity for her as an artist, even though they also saw there was this sort of this tension because she was getting increasingly isolated. Okay, so from here, I'm going to talk about how these social prognoses shape practices around client choice. And client choice is an ideal in each of the settings that I was looking at, much as the way recovery is an ideal in each of these kinds of settings, but they have different definitions of it. So at DMH, because housing is basically what they mean by recovery, it leads to a kind of generalized harm reduction. People will make choices and you try to reduce the harm. At actualization, because recovery is tied to class respectability, it leads to a kind of paternalistic micromanaging of choices. So what's this look like? In a way, things that are seen as problem behaviors become sort of de facto client choice. So here's what Laura, the FSP team leader, once said. Well, at least they're safe. People like them are not going to do what we want, but what can we do? These are the behaviors that kept them in the streets. And the way I came to see it, and this is something I explore more in the book, and I can't focus on it too much here, but housing first and harm reduction can become what I call tolerant containment. So it's this kind of stripped out version of harm reduction where there actually isn't that much sort of care sort of followed up, sort of the spatially specific acceptance of problem behaviors, basically trying to keep people alive and out of the way. So we spatially contain them, and then we tolerate things that arguably you might not think should be tolerated. What does this look like? So it means things like redirecting problem behaviors to avoid eviction, because that's one of the most important things is avoiding eviction. So Sandy was a white woman in her 40s, diagnosed with schizophrenia. She moved into a new apartment, and she created a problem, which was that she was banging her head on the wall. She shared with her neighbor, who's paying market rate in LA. He's very upset. He's trying to get her evicted. And so I went with Beth, the social worker, and she came up with this solution, which was very creative, which was instead of banging your head on the wall that you share with your neighbor, you bang your head on the wall that goes out to the street, so it doesn't make up as much noise, upset your neighbor, and get you evicted. Another strategy they had was, again, not trying to change behaviors, but to change the fit in the ecology. And so here's what Beth said to Sandy. You can choose to live like this, but not in this building. We might need to find you a dirtier building. And this is something I actually saw several times at the DMH clinic, which was if somebody was at risk of eviction, you move them, say, deeper into downtown. And this was really fascinating. Mr. Daniels, the Born Care owner, I once asked him about the fact that his residents didn't seem to do anything during the day, and he tried to convince me that it was their choice not to do anything. And he had a very strange analogy, which was that it's like being a retiree. He said, "You ever hear of the Catskill Mountains? I used to work there during the summer. People, they would wake up in the morning, go to breakfast, sit on the veranda, take a little rowboat out on the lake, come back for cocktails for dinner. They're happy. Leave me alone. That's what I paid for." But of course, his residents aren't people on vacation in the Catskills. They're living in a pretty dumpy board and care in LA. Now, how to think about client choice at actualization? It's very different than this kind of generalized harm reduction. People will make choices and you reduce the harm. And you can see this most clearly when you talk, when they reflect on things like housing first. And I had a really interesting conversation with Dev, who was a case manager who himself had been an actualization client after he'd been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder during college. He then went on to become a social worker. And so he had experienced himself as a client in actualization, but had also been a social work intern at a Housing First program. And he said, Housing First programs don't care if you don't take meds, even if you do drugs to a certain extent. They're more kind of about keeping you out of prison, keeping you out of the revolving door of hospitalizations. That's ultimately their goal. It saves the county a lot of money. But what if you want more than that for your loved one? And of course, from Dev's perspective, if you want more than that for your loved one, you don't just tolerate their choices. And so what does this look like? In some cases, that meant the actualization clinic was trying to, they were trying to generate appropriate choices by removing choices. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So Roy was a white man in his 30s diagnosed with schizophrenia, what they perceived as primarily negative symptoms. He just stayed at home and wanted to watch TV. And the actualization clinic they do this thing where they like give narrow options. Here's what Deirdre, the clinical director, said. We don't want to infantilize our clients, but it's like with my kids. If I ask them what they want to do, they want to be on their phone. You want a bike ride or get something to eat? If they want something else, you say, sorry, that's not an option. And so they gave Roy some options, none of which was getting to stay at home. And he settled on one, which is a sort of restaurant therapy, which is they would take him out to busy restaurants to help him learn to tolerate the anxiety that was produced when he'd be in these social settings. And in fact, Roy later told me that it was better than any medication I've ever received. It helped him. Now he could go do more activities with his family in the community. For others, it's experienced differently. There's kind of this obligation to have an increased quality of life. So Kayvon was a Persian man in his 60s diagnosed with schizophrenia. His case manager was Dev, who we met a moment ago, who was talking about Housing First. And Kayvon believed any new activities would cause a catastrophic event in his brain. And he was very scared. But Dev forced him to do things like play soccer. And it was once after we went and we all played soccer, Dev told him, you're going to have to do more new activities. And Kayvon said, please, Dev, no. He was terrified. And Dev put his foot down and said, well, it would be a disservice if I allow this to continue because it impacts the quality of your life. And Dev, reflecting on this later, made this really interesting observation. He said, with the private sector, I don't know if the right word is you can get away with more. But for instance, with Kayvon, we push through things. But in the public, I might not be able to do that. They could think that's not ethical. But of course, for Dev, he's the one who's being being ethical. It would be unethical to let Kayvon sit around all day doing nothing. Okay, so in summary, I'm coming back to this idea that social prognosis refers to the types of lives and identities people with illness can expect to have. We're looking at these different clinics that have these different kinds of goals. And the key feature, again, is that the prognosis is less in the patient themselves and more in the clinic and in the wider context, in such a way that it can become disconnected from what the client seemingly needs at the time. And now, again, as I mentioned, right, it's like once we put these things side by side, we can hopefully look at them with fresh eyes. So to sort of fill in that little table from before, so DMH, there's the clinical project, which is largely focused on managing urban poverty, whereas at the actualization clinic, it's on sort of restoring family systems. The social prognosis for clients is we can make you into a housed person who's not triggering 911 calls. The social prognosis of actualization is about building this kind of robust, respectable, class-respectable identity. The mismatch at DMH is sometimes you're serving a client who's quite stable, and then they don't have too much more to offer people. At actualization, you have clients who are sort of not achieving in the proper way. And then in terms of client choice, you have these very different ideas about client choice. You have a kind of harm reduction and radical choice perspective at DMH. You can choose to use drugs or refuse meds. At actualization, you have this emphasis on sort of managing proper choices. And the choice not available there is to be a psychotic street person or to refuse. So what are the consequences for patients? And this is just sort of my subjective interpretation based on what I saw. I'm very curious what you all think as clinicians. So the risk I saw in the public safety net is that the vision of recovery is extremely constrained, and clients' dreams are essentially ignored. Recall Jeremiah, who was very grateful to the DMH FSP, but he also felt like I still have something to contribute. I'm young, and there are few aspirations for clinical improvement beyond the house, not in jail, not in the hospital. And housing first and harm reduction, which are incredibly important interventions, risk becoming what I call simply tolerant containment. The risks in the elite care settings are quite different. So one thing that can happen is that the family viewpoint can become too dominant. There can be these kind of unrealistic goals. So think about in terms of family viewpoint, the man who's pushed to leave his job at P.F. Chang's. Think about Anthony, who is doing all of this therapeutic work. He thinks he's going to be able to achieve this thing. The clinic doesn't think he can, but they won't tell him. This idea I mentioned of individualized treatments becoming too individualistic. So Shelley's goal of becoming an actress, and the way that all of her focus on just achieving her own goal here, and the clinic's working with her to achieve that goal, actually, she ends up not being socially integrated, even though the clinic says that's a chief aspiration. And then I didn't get into this here, but this is something I cover in the book, which is that some of these elite places, because they don't have a harm reduction component, they just wash their hands of clients who one would think they would be able to engage, but because they have more of a sobriety model or this kind of higher achieving model, they're just not very good at dealing with this. And any time a client presents too much risk, they basically cut the case. Okay, so what can clinicians do? I mean, I think one thing is trying to work towards organizational change. So it might mean rethinking some of the metrics of success in some of these settings, thinking beyond housing and saving money and, reduction in jail days, even though those are, of course, very important things. In the elite settings, it might be pushing back against family demands. I think also there could be space for reflection and frame change in clinical training. So I think that young clinicians in training could be asked, are our visions of the client future here based on the client or based primarily on the milieu and what we think is appropriate for these kinds of people? So I think perhaps the social prognosis framework could become part of instruction and structural competency. And then finally, of course, policy advocacy, because some of these things, the social prognosis itself can't really change without the kind of material changes needed, right? Like, of course, the DMH clinic is going to focus a lot of their time on housing and homelessness when we have a homelessness crisis at this level. So what can doctors do? Doctors can use their expertise and their social position to work with advocates, social movements, or different political actors to really try to change these underlying conditions. Just to speak very briefly about some of the policy writing I've been doing. So one thing I've been arguing is that this tolerant containment, as I've mentioned, is becoming a kind of de facto social policy across California. So we've ended up with this kind of right to be homeless with no right to housing, a kind of right to drug possession, but no right to rehab, a right to refuse psychiatric care, but no right to psychiatric care. So it's happening across domains, and at least in this piece, I try to explain historically how we came to this, and the focus is on left civil liberties victories, at the same time that we've had conservative fiscal policy with things like Prop 13 from the 70s, which have created this kind of pretty ugly compromise. And then another piece I did with Alex Bernard of NYU, this is another Washington Post piece, was looking at how we can try to design care courts or hospitalization or even asylums in a kind of harm reduction model of making necessary coercion less bad. And one of the most important ideas here is about getting ex-patient activists on board, many of whom are staunch critics of coercive care, but getting them to be integral to design to try to create a better system. And then, if you're interested in more, the book's coming out soon. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and questions.
Thanks so much, Neil. Really terrific. Thank you so much for all of that data and framing. Really, really interesting work. Would love to hear questions or comments. It's a guess, Neil, but I suspect you'd like to hear how much of this feels like it rings true, which elements of it seem familiar to the clinicians in the audience. For instance, working in the UCLA context as opposed to a county context, I think we may find some of these dynamics to be familiar. And I'm sure, Neil, that would be helpful to
Oh,
hear.
absolutely.
So yeah, thank you for throwing that into our questions. Neil, maybe I wanted to raise with you a question I'm curious about. It's so striking to hear actualization clinicians refer to your loved one, refer to the patient as your loved one or the loved one or a loved one, which is very unusual in my experience in a public context, in a county context. And often in a county context, we might be working with people who really don't have family contacts around. And I've been struck too at how how readily I find myself sometimes forgetting that this is a family member. This is a son or a daughter or a father or a mother, and situating the individual within a family for myself as a clinician can shift things, just how I think about the client in a way. But I know as well, having family members present with an individual and present in their lives can shift care processes in really fundamental ways. I don't know if you have some observations about that issue, maybe some experiences where, for instance, in the county clinic context, an individual who became reunited with family, and perhaps that shifted how the clinicians were thinking about the situation. What role does the family dynamics and family context play?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. That's a great question. So I think it does fundamentally shift how we think of a person. If you engage them, or if you're engaged primarily through, the first person you meet is, say, the mother who's paying for care directly, or has brought the person in, and you think of them as someone's loved one. It can work in both positive and negative ways. So on the one hand, you have these family members who are present and can bring you, here's what this person was like before some of this stuff happened. Here's some of what their goals were. It can also become problematic, as I've mentioned, when you have highly involved family members who, in many cases, at least the way actualization would talk about it would be people would be pushing for healthy activities too soon, for instance, like trying to get someone back to college right after a psychotic break, or trying to achieve things that might at the moment not quite seem realistic. As far as, at DMH, yeah, so especially with folks who've been on the street, in many cases, they're quite disconnected from family. But I did see, people get reconnected after years of either estrangement or just they'd lost touch. And it could really shift how they were viewing their lives. I'm thinking of one woman who had been a street-based sex worker, addicted to crack for decades. She was housed. She eventually started just reducing crack on her own. I mean, this is sort of what, Housing First can do, which is like she just felt safe and started to reduce her use. And she got in touch with her family, and they welcomed her with open arms. The clinicians told me, like, now suddenly they were working on different things. Like, for one thing, they were actually trying, as they said, try to help her stick around longer. So they started focusing on her physical health more, because where she had maybe just thought of like, yeah, she was a little older on her way out. She wanted to stick around, work on her health, because now she was connected with her children, who she hadn't seen in a really long time, as well as her mother. There was actually another case that was sort of similar, although went in the opposite direction, which was that the family rejected the person after they remade contact, and that woman drunk herself to death within the year. So I think family can be both very powerful in a positive way, but also things can go wrong in those two ways. One, the over-involved family that actually isn't listening to what might be appropriate, and then this kind of family rejection can be quite awful.
Right,
So we have
right.
some other questions here, or do you want to pick them, Beth, or did you want to?
We do some great questions here. Yeah. From Laura Van Tosh, the federal government has defined recovery. Do you think their leadership will help turn the tide? Interesting question. The extent to which a recovery orientation might shift some of the dynamics in public service settings.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Really great to have you here. I think this is one of these things where like you can shift the definitions, and that can be an important first step. But those definitions are also embedded within an institutional context. So you can define things as related to family and reintegration, but if people don't have family members, you can't really do that. I think that the social prognosis and the recovery of we're going to get people housed and out of jail is going to be primary until those things aren't kind of like at the forefront of people's heads, right? So like, if we can't solve our housing crises, if we can't do a better job of keeping people from ending up incarcerated to begin with, those things will continue to dominate and form the unofficial definition of recovery, right? So you have like whatever official definitions of recovery, but you also have these kind of institution or organizational level ones that are the practice-based definitions. And so I mean, it's great if to have maybe a consistent one, but it's still going to be dependent on the kind of social and material resources that are available within these different settings. Let's see.
Right.
Beth,
Excellent.
should I just?
Yeah, go right ahead. I think Michael's question is a really interesting one. How do your analyses apply to a kind of what we could consider
Yeah.
middle of the road, middle class program, such as an HMO at
Yeah. Oh, like
Kaiser?
Kaiser. Okay, interesting. Great. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, so I was really interested. I met people who had, like, as I mentioned, taken their loved ones off of private insurance, moved to different Medi-Cal programs, or trying to access like a county FSP. And then, Kaiser also is infamous for, their therapists going on strike saying we're not able to actually deliver quality mental health care. I think, yeah, okay, so there's the constraints, but there may be a more stable family system. Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen some families end up doing things that are maybe some combination of both, right? They're trying to keep the person in the family home. They have access to some therapeutic resources through something like Kaiser. And I think maybe there's more stuff. Just this is no, I've not collected this systematically at all, but just talking to people that, since the pandemic, some things like, these in-home IOPs or in-home partial hospitalization type setups might mean people are able to access more care. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably some potential for that. I think, though, I've also seen middle-class families end up replicating a version of tolerant containment, which is they've either just learned to tolerate an immense amount of disruption in the family home, or if they can afford it, they'll rent an apartment for their loved one who will then maybe use drugs and act bizarrely in that apartment. I actually, yeah, I wish I had more data on something like that. So that's just sort of me speculating. And then, okay. Okay, so, what is it ask? Okay, thank you to Jeffrey. What is your aspirational model of care and treatment? What does the state public sector owe people with psychiatric problems? I think the aspirational model is going to actually be a blend of things that I saw in both the public safety net and some of these elite private care places. I mean, I think there's absolutely an important role for things like housing first, this kind of harm reduction model, meeting people where they're at, and then, presuming you also don't just do the housing first, housing only, but you do have these kinds of robust wraparound services coming. And again, like I said, it's probably gonna be hard for them to do that when they do have to cope with homelessness as a primary issue. I mean, I think what the state public sector owes people with psychiatric problems is, so first, those kinds of stabilizing interventions, absolutely. Kind of housing first, getting people safe and comfortable, but it really shouldn't stop there. And so I think that it means that, right, you also have a mentality which is, we don't just become comfortable saying, oh, that person's not doing anything all day. That's their choice, right? Like Mr. Daniels, the born care operator, who says it's their choice it's like being in the Catskill Mountains. It's like being retired. So I think that on the one hand, we do owe people this kind of stabilizing intervention, but then also more than that. And there's some people where, it's going to be inappropriate to try to, push them to hit various middle-class benchmarks. And so it's okay to just focus on safety. But I think that we too often do that just because, we lack the resources to offer them anything else. So I think we do owe people a chance at their dreams, right? So for Jeremiah, who I mentioned, he feels totally stuck. They think at DMH, that's what hope looks like. For him, he's sort of given up his future. I think we have to act like poor folks with serious mental illness diagnoses also deserve a future. Okay, Colin, hi. Thank you for this thought-provoking talk. The cases all resonated deeply as someone who's worked with high-income families while training at UCLA and on an FSP team. Essential struggle for me is finding a balance between what the patient says they want and what we, their family, society expects or wants for them. Would appreciate hearing any thoughts you have on that. Thanks. Yeah, that's a really hard one. I don't think I have, I certainly don't have the answer. I mean, I think what I'll say is that, yeah, so much really does, of course, depend on the individual person and what we can offer them. So what I mean by that is like, I think there are times you can push people, and the moral calculus of it is like, can something be sort of delivered on the back end? So it would seem kind of cruel to push people, quote unquote, normalize them, push them into different kinds of therapeutic compliance to try to quote unquote fix them. And then what is the life they have on offer? It's to be, a poor person living in LA in one of the most expensive places around, working 3 jobs just to barely not even cover rent, right? On the other hand, if people have real options, and this is something that's true of wealthier people. I mean, I'm thinking of one young man who was in a dual diagnosis program, and at a certain point, and he'd been raging, but he eventually calmed down and was like, "Oh, this is really interesting, and like maybe I want to be a psychiatrist. I'm going to do all of these things in this program." And he could actually be a psychiatrist, right? Like his family has money, he could go to a good school, all of this kind of stuff. And so I think the calculus around it sort of depends on pushing people, also depends on what kind of life they can actually be offered. This is why I think this thinking about the horizons, the future horizons, is so important. I will also say though that I did meet people who I think realistically the best thing for them would be that kind of leave them alone mentality of the it's like the Catskill Mountains, they're retired, or to just be in their apartment doing their thing. It's hard to know, right? And again, you don't want it to be that we just accept that because that's what we do for quote unquote those kinds of people. So I think it has to be something that gets tested out over time, and at a certain point, clinicians might realize that's what's appropriate for this person. But we've actually figured that out, not just defaulted to it. Okay, Vivian, hi. At one point, there were halfway houses. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, there it goes. And 3/4 way houses so that housing and treatment were combined. This was a vision for helping hospitalized patients get treatment as they move into the community. Is there a space for this type of treatment on the way back into housing and community? So I did come across, right? So one of the really interesting things is that there aren't more nice boarding cares, or like boarding cares that are for wealthier people. There's not in LA County. There's a few in the surrounding areas where there is more of this focus on on-site care and treatment, as well as social integration through maybe vocational training, getting people to work, and things like this. But part of it's just the economics of the boarding care system, at least for public patients, where they fund it by kind of harvesting people's SSI checks, and you get maybe a small additional funding bump from the county. But some of the stuff I presented from Mr. Daniels, the boarding care operator, I think makes him look kind of bad, but realistically, he's also trying his best. And so as it stands, yeah, there aren't really good options like this, but I think that would be fantastic. I think the boarding cares, we need to save them from being, from sort of going out of business. But then we also really do need to redesign them so that there is care on site, that people have real options. And I also think it can be really important to have these facilities at least co-run by residents. So, okay, that's probably, yeah, we're coming up just on time. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm also, feel free, I would love, if you have any thoughts, please email me, contact me some other way. I'm also presenting some book chapters at UCLA Sociology on Friday at 10:30 a.m. And so if you're interested, please email me. I'll send you the stuff and the info.
Wonderful, Neil. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your work. I think you really shine a spotlight on issues we all care so much about and are so important for our profession. So glad you're doing this work. Thanks for coming today. Thanks
Thanks so much for
everyone for
having me.
joining us.